World War II. First thing to notice is September 1, Poland. Help me here. We have a Polish expert. How do you pronounce that? Wierun. So the W is pronounced like a V in English. Wierun. Well, Wierun was bombed. 70% of the town was destroyed. A hospital was hit. Several hundred at a minimum were killed. I mean, depending on who you talk to, but you know, lots of dispute. Again, people do not appreciate the extent to which Nazis had a sense of shame. They did not admit to a lot of things. One of the complaints of Heidegger about the fascist Nazis was they weren't honest enough and didn't embrace killing and brutalizing people enough. He was very disappointed in the Nazis. I don't want to exaggerate this, but they did not admit to this. Very important. Arguably, something like that happened in Rotterdam, where they got the resistance to give up, threatened before that to bomb the city center, went ahead anyway. It could have been an accident, miscommand. It could have been for real, lots of confusion. No one ever admitted that, oh no, we did that on purpose. But it certainly spooked the government. They surrendered after this because they were threatened again that their capital would be knocked out next. I think the next event is also interesting and is indicative of why city busting should not be clearly associated with these events yet. We've all heard about the Battle of Britain, I suspect, right? Right. Well, how did that get going? Well, first of all, you should know that the Nazis were a little confused, or a little conflicted, maybe is better to put it. Did anybody look at the lecture notes, even in passing, for this class? Well, there's some nodding. By the way, please read it for selfish reasons. I want you to correct it. It's a manuscript, and if it's opaque, stupid, or unclear, I need to correct it before I submit it. So help me out. But in there's a footnote 13 that's really interesting. Some of the footnotes actually are kind of interesting. That one is. It's about a guy who is in the air command for the German government in the 30s, and he's making the case you shouldn't waste your time, should not waste your time bombing cities. It'll just stiffen the resolve of the people you're bombing because they're going to hate you even more, and it's a distraction. His name was Walther Wegener, Chief of Staff of the Luftwaffe. Now, he made his case, people sort of listened to him, and then everyone said, nah, no, we'd really like to do that. But there was a bit of a debate. I think if you read more and more history about what happened with the British king and his abdication and what the Germans may or may not have been doing with him, you get novels about how maybe they were going to set him up to run Great Britain again. I mean, I don't know if you can prove that. Probably can't. But Hitler may not have really wanted to bomb the city centers for a lot of rational reasons. I threw out two. But what happened, of course, is a mistake. They dropped some bombs accidentally on some residential areas in their first attempts to bomb Great Britain. The British, which had a Royal Air Force bomber group, which was desperate to show that they might be the way to win the war, even though there weren't many of them, hit Berlin. And then, oh, game on. 30,000 people were killed in Great Britain as a result. It took months. Now, it's interesting, the interwar people in the RAF really believed in bombers, and they thought, give us the bombers and we'll get the war done right away. Luckily, I think, Churchill and others didn't listen to him. They said, no, I think we're going to focus on something called radar and air interceptors. And had they not, this war could have been over a lot sooner, maybe. We don't know. But it certainly wouldn't have been a whole lot bloodier, because those air interceptors kept it down to 30,000. Not only that, they got Hitler to back off. During this period, and because of these things, the French were very keen on keeping the British from bombing Germany. They did not want to be the recipient of the comeback. And there was a concern even about chemical bombing during this period. It wasn't like the French, the Germans, the Soviets, and the UK did not have chemical weapons. They did. Okay. Initially, before they got into bombing Berlin as a retribution raid, before and after the Battle of Britain, there was a focus on military targets. And instead of bombing cities, the bomber command focused on the subpens in France, military industrial targets, collection yards. They tried to go after the Ruhr, etc. The problem was, I don't know if you can see this, but let's see here. You see these are little holes, right? Those are craters, right? That's called missing. Those are misses. What are they trying to hit? Oh, the rail line. Oops. Now, the people who were doing the bombing were very upbeat. And people like you. We did great. Well, how great did you? 1,000 yards. We got it within 1,000 yards. There was some skepticism about this, and there was a man named Butt who put infrared cameras on the bombers to check how well they were doing. Now, this is an eye chart for my benefit. Please don't strain to read it. It's in the lecture, but they claimed, you know, they inflicted all kinds of damage. But in fact, Schernwell, who's a scientific advisor, instructed Butt to do a study. And what they came up with initially is they said, okay, let's do infrared at night, because what had happened is when they did daytime runs, they got shot at. And so they went to nighttime, but they still claim they got within 1,000 yards. In fact, if you do infrared photographing, you can find out exactly how far away from the target you were. And what they discovered is that out of, what is it, only 10% of the bombers flying against nighttime Ruhr industrial targets found their way within 75 square miles of the intended targets. And if you took all the operations, only 5% got within that close. Now, I'm going to explain something called CEP, okay? What does it mean, 75 square miles? Essentially, CEP is this, and people talk about CEP, accuracy today. And they talk, well, what's your CEP? Well, CEP roughly is a circle that defines where 50% of your bombs came closest to hitting the target. And it's defined by that radius, and it's an area of a circle, so it's pi r squared. All right? It's just basically a target. So 75, does anybody know what pi is? Was it? 3.14. I used to work for a senator from Indiana, and the state legislature there decided and got everyone to vote to take it easy on the kids, and they said, just round it off to 3. So we're going to use the Indiana standard to make it easy on you. So essentially, if it's 5 squared is 25 times pi, Indiana standard, 3. What's 3 times 25? 75. Well, there you go, solution. So that is what the Butt report was talking about right there, okay? Well, one of the conclusions that was reached by some of the WAGs after they got the Butt report is, what the heck are we spending money on bombers for? Navy, Army could use the cash. This is a waste of time and money. Boy, the Royal Air Force didn't like hearing that. So as a compensation, you know how bureaucracies are. First you criticize, and then you do something nice. This was something nice. So, well, maybe we could use the bombers for something else. And they said, oh, we've got an idea. Why don't we just simply have them aim against cities? They're lit up, they're easy to find. And they said, if you give us 5,000 bombers, we can turn 1/3 of Germany's population, get this, out of house and home by mid-43. Now that expression, out of house and home, has a certain aristocratic British ring to it. I have this kind of idea that a butler is going to come knocking on your door and say, well, we need to move you today. The removalist is here. We're moving you out of house and home. First, they tried a 1,000-bomber raid. It killed only less than 500. And the reason why is the fire department worked. And there was a lot of brick. So they tried again. This one, a little bit more deadly. 40,000 killed and 1 million homeless. Now, how did this work? Well, we can go to this famous raid, and you can read a whole novel about this, Slaughterhouse-Five. If people think that they were going after communication centers for the military, well, okay, there's something to that. But let's take a look at what the operation consisted of. What they dropped first were munitions designed to blow the roofs off. Okay, well, maybe that's all right. Then they dropped incendiaries designed to produce firestorms so that the oxygen in that region would go away and it would kill anyone in the firestorm. But just to add insult to injury, they then dropped bombs that had proximity fuses that would go off if anyone survived and came out of the basement. This had to do with killing people, folks. Does anybody know when the first Royal Air Force memorial to the bombing section of RAF was put up in Great Britain after the war? I think it was 1998 or 94. There were debates in the British Parliament about the morality of doing this. It's interesting. So when people say, oh, no, that wasn't what it was about. No, actually, they argued about it pretty clearly that that was what it was about. And I think if you read even Churchill, he's pretty clear about that. Trying to see if I can find that quote. Well, I think it's later in the lecture, but trust me, he and others were pretty clear about that being part of what it was about, big time, like almost 90% of what it was about. It was done because that was all we could do with the bombers. We couldn't find the targets. The bombers themselves were vulnerable if they went in daylight. They had to go at nighttime. This was the one thing they could do to contribute to the war effort. So I don't want to paint this as, oh, well, this is awful. They shouldn't have done this. I'm going to tell you, this was awful, and I don't know if they should have done this. Let's not be overly judgmental, but let's not embrace this as, oh, this is clearly the way to go. There's a picture for you. Well, let's talk a little bit about Germany and the lessons learned for the war in the Pacific. First of all, let's talk about the mobilization-based argument about bombing in Germany. It was argued that, oh, we got to do this so that they don't have a war industrial effort, since the stuff that matters is in the cities. And that's certainly true. However, guess what? They moved it out into the forests and the caves. So they started to mobilize after the area bombing, which would kind of suggest that this was not an immediate payoff kind of proposition. Now, I think it is true, if you study the figures, that had they not done this, the mobilization in 42 to 44 would have been much more robust. But let it be known that the production rate went up from 42 to 44, despite this. My guess is it would have been even sharper increase without it, so this is something to consider. There also was an argument about morale, and it did affect morale in the German case for obvious reasons. You hear Speer in his memoirs pointing out that the troops on the Eastern Front were worried about their sweethearts and what was happening in Berlin or Rotterdam or Cologne. They did not want to be fighting, trying to take Moscow when that was going on. I think beyond that, and this is a really important point, I think, Hitler mobilized the German politics of resentment because most Germans in the First World War felt that they were winning the war or not losing it, but they were stabbed in the back by the politicians. It can be said in defense of the area bombing that disabused anybody that they were winning. It disabused them that had they just lasted a little longer, it would have paid off. And that was something consciously argued at the time, that we have eliminated that problem because it was very difficult to get the Germans in First World War to surrender. It wasn't so easy in this case either, but it was easier, it was argued, because of this. And why is that important in understanding this? Well, if you think the Germans were slow to say enough, read that book by Hastings, Retribution, about what we were up against with regard to the Japanese. Have you ever heard of the word Bushido? Anyone heard of that? Yes. Well, that means to the bitter end, roughly. And what they did would make you blink and your jaws go slack. They would not only fight to the death, they would take any civilians in the area where they were fighting and kill them too, or make them commit suicide. This was a bit more than even what the Nazis did. We were not ready emotionally for this. And it was argued, well, we have to bomb the cities to make sure they don't think they're getting stabbed in the back, but they give up. So the area bombing with incendiaries of Tokyo, almost 100,000 dead, was more than the initial deaths of Hiroshima, which was roughly, I don't know, 40 or 50,000. Now, it turns out if you wait long enough, radiation and burns kill more. But the point is that the difference between the area bombing with incendiaries in Hiroshima had to do with efficiency. It was not a difference in kind. Also, it helped that in the case of the Japanese, the structures were made of paper and wood, not brick. And people said, well, we got to do this. Also, they ran out of targets, and people were very, very wary of losing troops in an invasion given after all the terrible campaigns in Okinawa. Now, I think when you read this defense of why we dropped the bomb, you will get these arguments. Someone pointed out, I didn't assign it, however, that the idea that we were saving lives is kind of difficult in a sense, because you're saving lives of people in uniform, it's argued. Now, is there a moral equivalence to saving those lives and the civilians that you killed to get those lives saved? Or is the argument, well, we would have had to kill even more civilians to save the... I mean, it gets kind of difficult. I think that's the reason why you want to keep this debate open. If you're a human, if you're an idolide, you pick one or the other answer. But if you're smart and moderate and human,
you struggle with this, okay?